Welcome back to the channel. This is a video on how to replace the lower ball joint on a 2012 Nissan Titan 4-wheel drive. I went to take my truck in for an alignment and they told me they couldn't do the alignment because the ball joint needed replaced. Unfortunately, it's more practical just to replace the whole lower control arm when doing this. I was quoted over $700 at the shop to do this. I'll probably have about $100 in parts. So let's get started. The first thing you need to do is get the vehicle up in the air and remove the tire. You also need to remove the caliper and the caliper bracket. If you don't know how to remove the tire or the caliper and the caliper bracket, don't attempt this project. Take it to a professional. So let's get into the video. Before I get started on removing this caliper bracket, I'd like to note the red wire that's holding the caliper up and it's not hanging by the flexible hose. Always, always, always use something to support the caliper. It's heavy and you don't want to replace that brake hose if you don't have to. So let's get this caliper bracket off of here. So the caliper bracket is held on by two bolts. I'm going to use this breaker bar just to loosen them, and usually I can take them out by hand. And that'll remove the caliper bracket and both of the brake pads. The next thing you want to do after removing the caliper bracket is to remove the rotor. I replaced the wheel bearing hub assembly in here not too long ago, so all these fasteners are lubed with anti-seize and they're coming apart quite easily. The next thing I'm doing right here is removing the junction for the flexible brake lines from its mounting bracket. It seems to be in the way of some things and I need more space, and to move the caliper out of the way I need to remove this. And it's held on by one 12mm nut. So remove that and you can slide the bracket for the flexible hose out of the way and move the caliper over to give you some more room to work. So once we have all the brake components out of the way and the rotor off, we can get into the real meat of the project, removing the lower control arm. The first thing I did was to zip off the nut that's holding the sway bar link to the lower control arm. As you see right here, it's held on by one nut, and you can put a crescent wrench on the inside and hold it while you zip the nut off. So as I hold the inside of the control arm or the stabilizer arm bracket with a wrench, you can take the nut off. Then the next thing I did was to remove the lower shock mount bolt. It's a 21mm, I believe. I had this recently removed to do the Bilstein shock replacement, which is in another video on the channel. Just hold one side with a nut with a wrench and zip that nut off, and the shock should pop out easily. So this part can be somewhat challenging. We're going to have to remove this bolt that slides through this knuckle that holds the ball joint on. Removing the bolt isn't such a problem. You just simply take the nut off and knock it out. But removing the ball joint stud from the knuckle can be somewhat problematic. Remember, in this instance, that heat will be your friend. You're going to have to probably heat this up and or spray some lubricant in there. And you want to have a set of pry bars to help you separate this, and a hammer that is probably at least a pound. I think I used a 3-pound hammer in this case. And then I decided to rap on it a bit with the 3-pound hammer and quickly found out that due to the looseness of the knuckle itself, that wasn't going to work at all. So I attempted to pry the ball joint apart with some pry bars, and that was unsuccessful as well. So then I decided to take a break from separating the ball joint stud from the knuckle and remove the two bolts that hold the lower control arm on. They're the adjustment bolts, and oftentimes these are frozen in the control arm. But I removed these bolts and found that mine were not frozen in, and I was able to take the bolts out easily, which is surprising for a 10-year-old vehicle in the Rust Belt with 83,000 miles on it. To save a little bit of time, I'll go ahead and speed up this disaster of using a pry bar and banging with a hammer to try and get the ball joint and the knuckle to separate. I ended up resorting to using a little bit of heat. I sprayed it with Seafoam Deep Creep to let it soak in there, and I hit it with a little bit of heat, and it ended up coming apart pretty easily actually after I added some heat to it. So after heating it up pretty good, I went back to the pry bar and the hammer, and I'm not sure how stuck yours might be, but it took some prying and hammering, and there it finally let loose. So that was the hardest part of the job, really, was getting this ball joint separated from the knuckle. But once you get that done, it's pretty straightforward from there. So the next thing that I soon found out was that you can't separate the ball joint from the knuckle because the axle shaft is in the way. So you'll have to remove the mounting points for the control arm to the frame and then remove the axle shaft and the ball joint stud at the same time. All of this can be a little tricky to manage by yourself, but it can be done because I did it. You'll see me moving the axle shaft here, and I'll need to remove the two bolts here and here to let the control arm down. We'll tap these bolts out and get the arms separated from the frame of the truck, and then we can remove the control arm. So once you've removed the frame mounting points, the control arm from the frame mounting points, then you're ready to bump the axle shaft out so you can remove the old control arm and ball joint. Pull the axle shaft out just like this by lifting up the knuckle, and then you can lift the whole arm out of place, making sure that the sway bar and link isn't holding everything in place still. And there you have it. Okay, so this is what the control arm looks like, and the diagnosis was a bad ball joint, and this one feels loose, but not terribly loose. I felt a lot worse. It needed replaced, but it doesn't feel terrible. The one thing that needs replaced is this bump pad for the suspension limit. There's this plastic pad here that needs to be removed from the old control arm and added to the new control arm that already has the ball joint pre-installed. This is a Moog control arm, and it was purchased off of Amazon. I think I got it from the Amazon warehouse for about $100, I think. So we'll go ahead and remove the one nut that holds the plastic bump stop on the control arm and replace it on the new control arm. So one product that I've been using on my Titan to coat the frame and the suspension components is this PB Blaster Surface Shield, and this product does a really good job. It's sort of like a fluid film on steroids. So I'm going to give this control arm a good spray down, especially on the inside through the holes, before I put it on, just to give it some corrosion protection. But I've been really happy with PB Blaster Surface Shield. It's done a great job for me, and it's really hard to wash off. It sticks really well. So one thing you're going to need in order to complete this project is a bolt kit like you see here. It's got these steel rings that are used for alignment, and you should buy this ahead of time anyway, so that when you go to put everything back together, you're not waiting on a simple bolt kit as holding up your project. So one thing I found out in a hurry is that you need to install the ball joint and the axle shaft prior to attaching the arm to the suspension. Just the mechanics of it, you need to install the ball joint and the axle shaft first and then attach it to the truck suspension. So I had to remove it and start over. So putting this back in place is not quite as tricky as it looks. Basically, you put the ball joint in first, put the axle shaft through, and then you can knock the lower control arm in place and attach it to the frame of the truck. I went ahead and also did the shock mount at the same time, and it all went together pretty smoothly. Just make sure when you're putting this back together or taking it apart that you have a pretty good assortment of pry bars to help you line up these suspension components. They'll really come in handy. If you don't have some pry bars, you can use broom handle, anything you can find, but you're going to need quite a few pry bars. And what I'm doing here is loose fitting the control arm. I put the sway bar end link nut on loosely and the bolts that hold the lower control arm to the frame loosely. I'm also lining up the shock mount, and I'll put this in place and put a bolt through that and just leave it loose so that I can move the control arm around, get everything lined up, hopefully get the ball joint stud in, and put the bolt in that holds the ball joint to the knuckle. And after getting all of the bolts installed, I went ahead and used the 32mm socket to attach the CV axle bolt and put a cotter pin through it. And then before I put the brake parts back in, I went around and hit everything with a good coat of PB Blaster Surface Shield for corrosion protection. And now it's time to reinstall the brakes. The brake or the caliper bracket goes on first. You can see the PB Blaster coating everywhere. And so put the brake caliper bracket on the rotor and the brakes, put them back together, and then you're ready to put the tire back on. Remember to torque down your lug nuts in a crisscross pattern and use a torque wrench to set the torque, which I did not show here after I was done with the impact. So total install time for this was about 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours. And the next step would be to take your vehicle and get an alignment immediately. When replacing any suspension component like this, you'll have to take your vehicle and get an alignment. And don't forget to pat yourself on the back, because you just saved yourself about $500 and you learned a valuable skill. If you find this kind of content helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always, I will see you in the next one. Thanks.